1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once, especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended.
Could have been?
I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony.
No, Wes, we don't only have witness testimony in ancient history. That's simply false. This is part 2 of my video series, responding to Wes Huff's appearance on Piers Morgan Uncensored. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, the link is in the description and also on the screen. In this episode, I am going to discuss the claim about the 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15. Then I'm going to talk about the conversion of Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. After that, I'll respond to some misleading remarks Wes Huff made about how historians evaluate evidence. These kinds of misunderstandings are surprisingly common among evangelical Christians. So let's dig in.
Paul says up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event. We have to account for what is the best inference to the explanation of this particular thing happening. And I would contend that given the historical data that we can look at, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to explain this from a historical perspective. And that when we do so and we look at the independent testimonies that all intersect on this particular event, we actually, the best explanation to that is that this event actually did take place.
Interesting. But there is a major flaw in this line of reasoning. Wes is treating this as if it were a mundane historical claim, like a battle, a coronation, or a solar eclipse. But it's not. We are talking about a supernatural event that completely changes the standard of evidence we should apply. Let me give you an example. If an ancient document said there was a blood moon during a battle, I'd accept that claim pretty easily. A blood moon is a total lunar eclipse. It happens naturally, it's predictable, and we have plenty of scientific data to explain it. If multiple sources mention the same event, it boosts the credibility. So what's the best explanation? The blood moon likely happened. But now imagine that same document said a man who had been dead for 3 days came back to life. That's a completely different category. We are no longer dealing with nature. We are dealing with the suspension of natural laws. Once a human dies, the cells break down, bacteria take over, and decomposition begins almost immediately. This process is irreversible. No doctor, no scientist, no technology on Earth can undo 3 days of decay in room temperature. And Christians know this. That's why they call it a miracle. They are not claiming Jesus, against all odds, survived and somehow recovered by natural means. They are claiming divine intervention overrode the natural order. But at the same time, they assume that the kind of evidence needed to establish a miracle is more or less the same as what we would accept for ordinary, everyday events. And that's the problem. I used this analogy in part 1, but it's worth repeating. If you told me you had scrambled chicken eggs for breakfast, I'd believe you. That's an ordinary, everyday claim. But if you said you had scrambled dinosaur eggs, that's a whole different story. Now I need more than just your word. If you then told me, I know dinosaur eggs don't exist anymore, but God gave them to me, so you should believe it. That would not make me more inclined to believe you. I would still insist that you give me more evidence to show that God did give dinosaur eggs to you. Not because I'm hyper-skeptical, but because that's what reasonable caution looks like. Just claiming that God did something isn't a substitute for actual evidence, and it doesn't make the claim more probable. If your story contradicts everything we know about biology, history, and basic reality, then yes, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. I'm not going to believe it just because you say God did it and it's true. That's not skepticism gone too far. That's just not being gullible. And speaking for myself, I'd rather not be gullible. And here's where the double standard comes in. Christians demand that others accept the resurrection claim partly based on Paul's reference to 500 unnamed witnesses. But when it comes to other religions, they are suddenly much more skeptical. Take Islam, for example. The Quran and later Islamic texts claim that Muhammad split the moon and ascended to heaven on a winged horse. Billions of people believe that. Would you? If not, why not? Or consider Mormonism. 11 men testified that they saw the golden plates Joseph Smith used to translate the Book of Mormon. Their names are documented. Their testimonies are printed in every copy of the Book of Mormon. But most Christians dismiss them without hesitation. They rightfully judge that even with 11 eyewitnesses, the miracle claim is still probably false. So let me ask my Christian viewers this. If an ancient pagan text said that a sage rose from the dead and appeared to 500 people, would you believe it? What if it said 5,000 people saw it, or 50,000? Would that number change your belief? And if your answer is no, if you would still doubt the claim, then here are two questions you need to honestly ask yourself. First, why don't you apply that same level of skepticism to Paul's claim about Jesus' resurrection? And second, if you wouldn't accept similar claims from other religions, why should non-Christians accept Paul's testimony just because it's in your scripture? Let me know in the comments. And if you insist that you are not using double standards, I would like to hear how you explain the difference. Hello, my friends, this is Shem, and welcome to Mindful Living. This channel is all about encouraging you to be mindful, not just toward the things we are told, but also toward the beliefs we already hold. Because let's be honest, some of the things we have accepted as true may not actually be true, and we owe it to ourselves to find out. That's why I think we shouldn't be afraid to evaluate our beliefs, even the ones that feel deeply personal or sacred. Especially when it comes to religious beliefs, it's easy to justify things with the word faith and leave them unexamined. But here, we challenge that mindset. We ask questions. We test ideas. And if that's something you value, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Now, back to the topic. Piers asks Wes Huff a very good question.
Paul the Apostle wasn't there for the resurrection himself, and there's no other reference really other than I think the 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's only one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
You're correct in the sense that 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once. However, when you corroborate those with the accounts that we find particularly in Matthew, Luke, and John, I think it does explain, especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended.
Could have been?
You know, it's not overt in the text.
Exactly. It's not overt. In fact, it's not even hinted at. Wes, when you say these gospel accounts corroborate Paul's claim, you don't actually mean that. What you are really saying is, you can imagine that the 500 witnesses Paul mentioned might have been present at Jesus' ascension. And because that scenario is possible in your mind, you believe it lends credibility to Paul's account. That's not corroboration, that's conjecture. You even acknowledge that the Gospels are silent about the presence of 500 people. So why present it as if the Gospels support Paul's claim? Let's be clear, how the four Gospels portray the resurrection has no bearing on the credibility of the 500 witnesses mentioned only in 1 Corinthians. Piers was right to point out that this claim appears nowhere else in the New Testament. And instead of grappling with that, you try to patch it up with imagination by suggesting that maybe, possibly, hypothetically, they were there. But we are talking about historical evidence, not creative writing. Hypotheticals without textual support are not historical data. If we treated your speculation as actual corroboration, then anything could be supported by simply imagining it into place. So no, there's no corroboration. And while it's true that the absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, in this case, the silence is telling. If 500 people had truly witnessed the resurrected Jesus at one time, why doesn't a single gospel mention it? That's not a minor detail. That's a game-changing claim. If such an event were widely known among early Christians, wouldn't at least one gospel writer want to include it to strengthen their account? It's worth comparing this to another strange episode, Matthew's report of dead people rising from their graves and walking around Jerusalem after Jesus' death, Matthew chapter 27, 52 to 53. That's an event you'd expect someone else to mention, but no one does. Not the other gospel writers, not Paul, not any early Christian author, just Matthew. The same goes to Paul's 500 witnesses. We are not saying the event must be false, but we are saying it's not supported by other sources, not just by the Gospels, but by any other early Christian source. And even Paul doesn't explicitly claim to know the identity of those 500 witnesses. He's simply passing on what he heard, as he says in 1 Corinthians 15. So let's be honest about what we are dealing with. This is a single, vague, second-hand report written decades after the fact, without names, locations, or even a rough time frame. It's not 500 independent testimonies. It's one man repeating a tradition. And if you were reading about this claim in a different religion, say 500 people who saw a Hindu deity rise into the sky, and it came from a single second-hand source with no corroboration, would you believe it? Or would you expect a bit more if it were true? Let's hear Wes talk about another piece of supposed evidence.
Even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think we have to explain these particular instances where we don't just have people who are friendly to this happening, but we have individuals who are actually hostile. In James, the brother of Jesus, who the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family was actually very hesitant in how public Jesus' ministry was.
Let's focus once again on the evidence we actually have, not what apologists want us to imagine. The only thing we know with any historical confidence is that Paul reports in 1 Corinthians 15:7 that James, the brother of Jesus, saw the risen Christ. But Paul doesn't say when this happened, what James believed beforehand, or how it affected him. Paul's list is not a biography, it's a summary of who saw Jesus appearing to them. Apologists often construct a tidy before and after story. James was skeptical, then saw the risen Jesus, and that changed everything. But that's just narrative projection. There is no source that tells us when James changed his mind, or why. The Gospels mention that Jesus' family didn't believe in him at one point during his ministry, John 7:5. But they don't document any progression from skepticism to belief. In fact, there is no textual evidence suggesting that James was still hesitant or hostile at the time of Jesus' death. For all we know, he could have become sympathetic or even fully supportive before the crucifixion. Wes also cites the Epistle of James, where James calls Jesus our glorious Lord. But let's be careful here. First, this letter doesn't even mention the resurrection. There's no claim in it that James saw Jesus after death, nor any biographical reflections about his brother. It's a general exhortation on moral living, filled with echoes of Jewish wisdom literature. It never says, I saw the risen Christ. It never even alludes to that experience. Second, calling Jesus our glorious Lord doesn't prove that James believed in the resurrection. Sure, it reflects high Christological language, but exalted titles like that were common in both religious and political writings of the time. People called emperors Lord, gods, glorious, and revered leaders all sorts of honorifics. If we took every instance of that kind of language as evidence of a resurrection belief, we'd end up seeing resurrection where it was never implied. Ironically, by appealing to the Epistle of James as though it supports resurrection, Wes undercuts his own argument. That letter contains no such claim, no narrative, no appearance, no event. If that's the best written evidence for James as an eyewitness, then the case is weaker than advertised. Wes isn't drawing conclusions from evidence. He is retrofitting evidence into a story he's already committed to. And that's not how responsible historical analysis works. Let's keep going.
likewise Paul, who started his life as a persecutor, and that has a radical 180 in terms of him then going on and writing the majority of Holy Scripture within the New Testament.
I'm not sure why Wes brings up Paul's conversion here, as if that somehow lends credibility to Jesus' resurrection. If an average Christian said that, I'd understand, but Wes is a New Testament scholar. He should know how shaky that appeal really is. Because when you look closely at Paul's conversion, it actually raises more questions than it answers. Let's start with the basics. Paul never claims to have seen Jesus in the flesh after the resurrection. His experience came years later, long after Jesus was supposedly crucified, buried, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. He wasn't at the empty tomb. He wasn't among the disciples during the supposed 40 days of appearances. He's entirely outside the chain of original eyewitnesses. And when Paul does describe his encounter, it's vague and lacking in detail. In 1 Corinthians 15:8, he simply writes, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." That's it. No location, no visual description, no mention of a body, just a broad claim that Jesus appeared to him. Paul mentions his conversion again in Galatians chapter 1, 11-12. "For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ." Again, the experience is described as a revelation, not a physical encounter. There's no mention of an appearance that could be observed or verified by others. In fact, Paul seems to go out of his way to emphasize that his understanding of Jesus came not from human contact, but from personal, internal revelation. And when we turn to the book of Acts, which gives us multiple second-hand versions of Paul's conversion, the pattern continues. In Acts 9:22 and 26, Paul hears a voice and sees a bright light, but not a person. In Acts chapter 9, verse 7, the men with him hear the voice, but see no one. That's not a shared physical appearance. That's more consistent with a vision or a religious experience. Now, I'm not saying Paul was lying. He clearly believed something profound happened to him, but people have life-changing religious experiences all the time. Grief, guilt, trauma, fasting, or intense spiritual searching can all lead to visions and sudden transformations. And you don't need supernatural intervention to explain that. Even modern science can offer insight. Clinical studies at institutions like Johns Hopkins University have shown that substances like psilocybin, the active compound in psychedelics such as magic mushrooms, can produce intense spiritual experiences. Participants often describe a sense of divine presence or connection to ultimate truth, and many report long-term changes in behavior and values. In one study, participants even quit smoking after a single guided session. No actual divine being required. If you want to explore this topic further, I will leave a link to a relevant video in the description below. So if Wes wants to put Paul's experience in the same category as the physical resurrection appearances described in the Gospels, that actually undermines the case for the resurrection. Because Paul didn't see a body, he didn't witness an empty tomb, he had a private revelation, the kind of experience that can be entirely internal, subjective, and easily explained through natural means. And if one of your star witnesses didn't actually witness anything that others could confirm, then calling it evidence for a historical resurrection is, at best, misleading. Let's hear from Piers.
All these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
That's an excellent question. How much weight should we give to the testimonies of ancient people, especially when those testimonies involve miracles, visions, or spiritual events? Let's be honest, even just a few hundred years ago, people still believed witches could cause diseases or summon storms. They were so convinced that entire societies imprisoned, tortured, and executed women accused of witchcraft. Should we conclude that witchcraft must have been real simply because so many people swore they witnessed it? Of course not. Sincerity is not the same as truth. People can be very sincere and very wrong. Piers is also right about eyewitness testimony. Courts still allow it, but they do so with caution, and only for ordinary claims. If someone testifies that they saw a man stab another in broad daylight, that's one thing. But if they say they saw a ghost commit the murder, no judge in the world is going to treat that as credible evidence, because no amount of sincerity can overcome the fact that the claim violates everything we know about how the world works. And the same principle applies to history. Historians study texts, letters, inscriptions, and artifacts to reconstruct what likely happened in the past. But when they come across a source claiming that Zeus came down in the form of a swan and impregnated a mortal woman, they don't include that in the historical timeline, not because they have ruled out the supernatural, but because there's no verifiable way to confirm it. A claim that contradicts natural law needs more than a story in a religious text. It needs extraordinary evidence to establish its truthfulness. And ancient hearsay doesn't meet that standard. You might say it is good enough for you, but thankfully, that's not good enough in academia. So when Christians insist that the resurrection should be accepted as historical just because some ancient people claimed to have seen Jesus alive again, the same logic applies. Testimony alone isn't enough, especially when the claim contradicts everything we know about death, biology, and physics. Let's watch how Wes Huff tackles this question.
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You know, you do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history in one sense is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on.
No, Wes, we don't only have witness testimony in ancient history. That's simply false. Historians also rely on coins, inscriptions, government records, architecture, ruins, personal correspondence, physical artifacts, and more. They are essential in supporting and contextualizing ancient claims. Take Tiberius, the Roman emperor Wes mentioned. His existence and reign are supported not just by textual sources like Tacitus or Suetonius, but also by coins bearing his image, laws and decrees in stone inscriptions, ruins of public works he commissioned, and archaeological layers dated to his reign. These are multiple lines of independent physical evidence. Now compare that to the resurrection of Jesus. We have no artifacts, inscriptions, or physical evidence that points directly to the event itself. Yes, there are early Christian symbols like the fish sign and graffiti, but those only show that people believed in Jesus. They don't prove that the resurrection actually happened. Belief is not evidence of the truth of what's believed. There's no contemporary documentation of the resurrection from neutral or external sources. All we have are written testimonies by committed followers, written decades later, often anonymously, with no names given for the supposed 500 witnesses and with contradictions between key details across the gospel accounts. So when Wes says we should use the same standards that historians use for figures like Tiberius, he's glossing over a crucial difference. Historians treat miracle claims differently because miracles, by definition, suspend the normal operation of the natural world. And textual testimony alone is never sufficient to establish that something supernatural happened. Even ancient historians writing about the emperors or military campaigns sometimes included supernatural claims, omens, gods intervening, dreams predicting the future, but modern historians do not treat those parts as historically factual, even if the same source contains accurate information elsewhere. Wes is trying to sneak miracle claims into the back door of history by pretending that they are just like any other historical claim, as long as someone wrote it down. But that's not how historical reasoning works. That's not how historians work, and Wes knows it. And here's the real irony. I doubt very much that Wes Huff would apply the same historical standards to miracle claims from other religions that he applies to Christianity. If a Hindu text claimed that Krishna lifted a mountain to shelter villagers from a storm, or if an Islamic hadith said Muhammad split the moon in two, would Wes insist that historians take those claims seriously just because ancient people sincerely reported them? Of course not. He'd likely say those were religious beliefs, not historical facts, and that historians are right to treat them as mythology or theological tradition rather than literal events. And yet, when it comes to Christian miracle claims that he believes in, suddenly he wants historians and skeptics to trust them as credible historical data. That's not objective scholarship, that's spatial pleading. In fact, many ancient historians, Greek, Roman, and Jewish, did include supernatural elements in their writings. They described gods appearing in dreams, divine voices influencing politics, and miracles happening in battle. Modern historians have no trouble recognizing those stories as part of the religious or literary culture of the time, not as literal facts. And you know what? Christians have no problem dismissing those stories either, until it's their religion on the line. So let's be consistent. If you dismiss miracle claims from other traditions because they lack sufficient evidence, you don't get to make an exception for your own just because it's yours. Now, I could be wrong because I'm not a professional historian myself. My background is in theology and psychology. So while I've spent a lot of time studying these topics, I don't claim to be an expert in historical methodology. If you are a historian, I'd love to hear your take. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. So, to sum up this episode, the claim about 500 witnesses sounds impressive until you actually look at the details. It comes from a single, second-hand report by Paul, written years after the fact, with no names, no context, and no corroboration from any other New Testament author, not even the Gospel writers. That's not strong historical evidence. And when people like Wes Huff try to defend it by appealing to the standards of historical methodology, they often gloss over the key fact. Historians do not treat miracle claims the same way they treat ordinary events. We have also seen how arguments like these often rely on spatial pleading. Christians dismiss miracle claims from other religions without hesitation, yet expect everyone else to accept theirs as historical fact based on far less evidence than they would ever demand from others. In part 3, we'll look at another common apologetic move Wes Huff makes, the claim that the disciples' willingness to suffer or die proves the resurrection must be true. Sad to say, Wes makes quite a few mistakes in that section too, mistakes that will take some careful untangling, but we are going to walk through them one by one. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 3.